They laughed at me for years. Every time I sat down at the kitchen table with my leather-bound notebooks, my son would roll his eyes. My daughter would sigh loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Dad and his novels. Who's going to read those? Nobody cares about your grocery lists. They thought I was scribbling away out of boredom. That those thick notebooks were just an old man's escape from silence. What they never understood was this: silence holds more power than shouting, and my pen carried more weight than their bank accounts ever would. The day of my funeral, they didn't cry. Not really. My daughter dabbed a tissue against a dry eye for appearances. My son kept checking his phone like he was waiting for a stock update. Neither of them noticed the smirk on the undertaker's face when he lowered the empty casket. Neither of them noticed that I was watching from less than 100 feet away, alive and steady, with a cap pulled low over my eyes. By the time they got back to my house, the house I'd built with my hands, they'd already started calculating. I know because I'd left a camera running in the living room. They came in laughing, coats half off, and went straight to the shelves. Not for photographs. Not for the medals from my years in service. Straight for the notebooks. My life's record, reduced to stacks of old junk they could sell. God, Dad really thought anyone would care, my son muttered, flipping a cover. My daughter snorted. Let's just put them online. Maybe some collector of antiques will pay $50 for the whole box. That was the moment the hook snapped shut. 3 nights later, the auction clock started ticking. They had no idea what they'd unleashed. The notebooks weren't random memories. Each one was layered like a minefield. On the surface, weather notes, grocery lists, a doctor's appointment. But between those lines I'd embedded ciphers, markers only I knew how to read. And tucked between glued pages? Photocopies, signed contracts, confidential memos, bribes recorded in my hand from 40 years ago. The kind of files that topple companies, bury mayors, and make federal agents sweat. At first, bids trickled in. $20, $45, $100. My son sent my daughter a smug text. Told you, we'll be lucky to get beer money. Then midnight struck, and the number jumped to $7,500. By morning, it was at $48,000. They were stunned. They thought they had won the lottery. My daughter squealed into her phone, "Can you believe it? Dad's garbage is actually worth something." What they didn't ask themselves was the real question: why would strangers fight over an old man's journals? I remember sitting in the motel room that week, coffee going cold, watching the bidding war like a general following troop movements. One account registered from Zurich, another from New York, a third traced back to Washington, D.C. These weren't hobbyists. These were sharks who'd scented blood in the water. And my children, my blood, had tossed the bait without hesitation. When the clock closed, the final price stood at $250,000. A fortune for them, but pocket change compared to what those books really meant. They smiled for the first time in years, thinking they'd finally squeezed value out of the old fool. That same evening, the knocks began. The first was a man in a dark suit at their doorstep. He didn't say condolences. He asked questions. Who had access to the notebooks? Did they read them? Did they copy anything? My son laughed nervously, insisting it was just family ramblings. But his voice cracked on the word ramblings. By the second knock, it was 2 men. Then 3. Different suits, different badges, all wanting the same thing, to know exactly how much my children had handled and who else they'd spoken to. I could see the panic growing in their eyes on the hidden camera feed. The same eyes that had once looked at me with dismissal now darted like trapped animals. And me? I sat back, steady, listening to their voices crack under pressure. My plan had only just begun. That night, in the cheap motel light, I opened one of my duplicates, a perfect copy I'd kept hidden. My handwriting stared back at me. If they sell these, they sell themselves. Exactly. Because what my children didn't know was that I'd planted 2 versions inside those journals. The authentic history and carefully forged editions. Editions that carried their names, their signatures. Proof they were tied to the same corruption they thought had nothing to do with them. They believed they'd cashed out my life's work. They didn't realize they'd just auctioned off their own noose. I leaned back in the chair, a dry smile creeping across my face. They always thought my notebooks were nothing. Soon, The world would learn they were everything. And my children, they were about to discover what betrayal really costs. The first voicemail came at 6:13 a.m. sharp. My son's voice, tight, brittle, almost unrecognizable. "Dad, if you can hear me somehow, call me. Please. Something's not right." I replayed it twice, savoring the irony. He'd spent the last 10 years ignoring my calls. Now he was begging a dead man to answer. By the time the sun had cleared the motel's parking lot, 3 more messages stacked up. My daughter's voice cracked on the second one. "They keep calling us. Different numbers. They know things, Dad. Things you never told us. What did you write in those stupid books?" Stupid books. She still hadn't learned. That afternoon, they discovered the first landmine. A local news station ran a teaser segment. Leaked diaries suggest corruption in Denver land sales, family names implicated. They blurred the documents, but not enough. Even in the grainy shot, I saw my son's signature scrawled at the bottom of a contract. He hadn't signed it, of course. I had forged it years ago, with deliberate imperfections only I could replicate. A safety net, a blade waiting in the dark. The panic must have been immediate. My camera feed showed my son tearing through boxes in the garage, sweat dripping, swearing under his breath. My daughter sat at the kitchen table, pale as chalk, scrolling news feeds, her hand trembling. And then the knock came. 2 men this time, clean suits, colder eyes. One flashed a badge from the Attorney General's office. The other never spoke, just scanned the room like a hawk circling prey. "We need to ask about your father's records," the first man said. "It appears your names are referenced in several documents. Were you aware of this?" My daughter stammered, No, we never read them. We sold them. That's all. Sold them." She said it like confessing murder. The man's eyes narrowed. "Sold? To whom?" She hesitated too long. The silence was an admission in itself. At 8:47 p.m., my phone buzzed again. A different number this time. My daughter's voice, frantic, whispering, "Dad, they think we're involved. They say there are checks, contracts, everything with our names on them. Did you plant this? Is this some kind of sick test?" Her breathing quickened. "Please, Dad, if you're alive, tell me what to do." I almost answered. Almost. But silence is sharper than any word. Instead, I prepared the next wave. See, every set of notebooks had 2 fates, the real ones locked in a fireproof chest under my motel bed, and the poison set, the ones my children had pawned off like fools. Inside those were photocopies of real contracts, but with subtle alterations. Company names tweaked. Signatures adjusted. Dates shifted just enough to incriminate. And the beauty? Anyone investigating would still find threads leading back to my children's current partners, the very businesses they'd staked their future on. By selling my notebooks, my children hadn't just betrayed me. They'd tied themselves to a conspiracy they couldn't explain away. 2 days later, my son's smug partner, the one who always sneered at my small life, filed for emergency bankruptcy. Local banks froze accounts. Shareholders demanded answers. The poison was spreading exactly where I'd aimed it. At dinner that night, I watched it live through the camera feed. My daughter slammed her phone down and shouted, "He did this. Dad did this to us." My son barked back, "He's dead." She glared, eyes wild. "Then why does it feel like he's still here?" They were right. I was. I leaned back in the motel chair, the steady hum of the mini fridge filling the silence. In the corner, the chest with the true notebooks sat untouched, my insurance. The game had only begun. Because in less than a week, when the headlines screamed their names in bold print, I would walk back into their lives. Alive. Calm. Holding the one thing they could never destroy, the truth. And then they'd finally understand. You don't laugh at a man's life's work. Not when that work is a loaded weapon. By the 3rd morning, the whispers had gone national. Legacy diaries rock local corporations. Family of late auditor named in explosive papers. Children cash in on father's secrets. The headlines crawled across every news ticker. I sat in my motel room with the curtains drawn, black coffee cooling in my hand, watching my children's faces on TV. Cameras caught them shoving microphones away, ducking into cars, looking less like victims and more like fugitives. My daughter wore her power suit, the navy one she'd bought with her husband's money. But her hands gave her away. They trembled as she tried to shield her face. My son wasn't better. Sweat glistened under his collar as he barked, "No comment," again and again. No comment is the cry of the guilty. And the world was listening. At noon that day, the first journalist knocked on their door. A young woman with sharp eyes and a recorder already running. "Mrs. Walker, sources confirm your name appears on fraudulent land deeds from 1981. Can you explain how your signature is present decades before you entered the industry?" My daughter froze. That's the beauty of forged dates. They ask questions no one can answer. She slammed the door. The journalist smiled at the camera like a cat with blood on its whiskers. "Before I'll tell you what happened next, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Thank you." The calls to me started again. My son's voice on voicemail number 24. "Dad, they're destroying us. These papers, they make it look like we inherited your corruption. We can't prove otherwise. If you're alive, please, just stop this." Alive. The word cracked in his throat like a curse. I didn't answer. Instead, I sent the next file. See, tucked in those poison notebooks were letters addressed to my children. I wrote them in my own hand years ago, sealed them in envelopes, and left them inside the pages. Fake letters, but signed with their names. Promises to continue the arrangements, admissions of understanding how the money flowed. The day after the auction, those envelopes surfaced online. A whistleblower blog published scans. Handwriting experts immediately declared them authentic. Of course they did. They were mine. And I knew every curve of their signatures better than they did. Now, the world believed not only had my children sold my legacy, they were part of it. That evening, I watched them argue in the kitchen. My hidden camera caught every second. "We have to deny everything," my son hissed, pacing like a cornered rat. "Deny?" My daughter snapped, voice breaking. "They've got letters, contracts, signatures. It looks like we were in on it from the start. Do you get it?" Dad framed us. Her husband muttered something off camera, and my son's fist slammed the counter. "He's dead." "Then why does this feel like he's right here?" she shouted back. Silence fell heavy. They both turned to the mantel where my photo still stood in its frame. My face, calm, steady, watching. They didn't move it. They couldn't. By Friday, subpoenas landed on their doorstep. My son's business partners abandoned ship. My daughter's accounts froze. The life they'd built on arrogance and greed cracked like thin ice. And just when the pressure reached breaking point, I made my move. Saturday morning, downtown Denver. A press conference called by the Attorney General's office. Rows of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones stacked like rifles pointed at the podium. They expected new evidence, maybe indictments. They didn't expect me. When I stepped into the light alive, composed, carrying one of my real notebooks under my arm, the room erupted. Shouts, flashes, chaos. Behind the noise, I saw them. My son, my daughter, both pale, jaws slack, eyes wide with horror. I adjusted the microphone and spoke 5 words. "My name is Henry Brooks." The room went silent. "And the truth," I said, holding up the notebook, "has finally come home." Their faces drained of color, because they knew what I held in my hand wasn't poison this time. It was the real story, the version only I controlled. And from that moment on, the game was mine entirely. The silence after my announcement was short. Then it hit, a storm of questions, cameras firing, microphones shoved toward me like bayonets. "Mr. Brooks, are you confirming you're alive? Did your children know about this? Why were your signatures on corporate fraud files? Are your son and daughter complicit?" The Attorney General's spokesperson tried to calm the room, but the fire was already spreading. I raised the notebook, let the room settle. My voice carried steady, louder than the noise. These are my words. My records. For decades, I documented corruption that infected our city. And when I realized my own children valued money over truth, I left them exactly what they deserved. Gasps rippled. Reporters scribbled like mad. My son looked like he might faint. My daughter clutched her husband's sleeve, lips moving soundlessly. Flashback, 3 months earlier. I'd been sitting at this very desk late at night when the plan came together. Not just to expose the corporations that bought politicians like candy, but to test my family, to see if blood meant anything to them. Turns out it didn't. They sold my life for $50 and champagne money, and I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. Back in the press room, I laid the notebook on the podium and opened to a marked page. Here, I said, tapping the line. A bribe logged on June 14, 1982. $50,000 transferred to a councilman to approve zoning for a mall. These entries have receipts attached. Originals, not copies. I turned another page, and here a list of shell companies, including Walker Holdings. My son froze. Walker. His company. Reporters surged forward, shouting, "Are you saying your son inherited a shell company tied to fraud?" I didn't answer directly. I didn't need to. The silence was louder than any confession. By the time the conference ended, headlines were already rewriting themselves. Father alive, drops bombshell evidence. Children implicated in decades-old scandal. Family betrayal at center of corporate storm. I slipped out through a side door while the circus roared. Outside, the cold Denver wind hit my face. Felt cleaner than any applause. That night, my phone lit up with 37 missed calls. All from them. The last voicemail I listened to in full, my daughter's voice, ragged, desperate. "Dad, please. You don't understand. They'll destroy us. You've got to fix this. You have to say it was all you. Please. We're your children." Children. The same children who'd laughed while selling my life to strangers. I set the phone down, poured a drink, and watched the city lights flicker through the motel window. They wanted mercy. But mercy wasn't part of my notebooks. The next morning, the Attorney General's office announced a full investigation. Subpoenas with my children's names were plastered on the evening news. And me? I sat in the back of a cafe, pen scratching fresh notes into a brand new journal. Because the story wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The real strike was still waiting. The part where they'd realize I hadn't just exposed them to the world. I'd also set up a private reckoning. One they couldn't escape. The summons came on a Tuesday. Hand-delivered, gold seal, black ink, the kind of letter you don't ignore. My son tore it open at the kitchen table while my hidden camera rolled. His lips moved silently as he read the words, "Appear before the State Ethics Committee." His hand shook. He passed it to my daughter, who gasped like she'd been punched. This is public," she whispered. "Of course it's public," her husband snapped. "Your father just put your names on national TV. He buried us alive." They argued for an hour. Blame bounced across the walls like ricochets. My daughter cursed me. My son cursed her. Neither of them once stopped to ask the obvious question, why had I done it? 2 days later, I gave them their answer. A package arrived on their doorstep. No return address, only their names written in my neat, deliberate hand. Inside, a single notebook. Not the poison ones they'd sold, not the originals I kept under lock and key. This was something new. On the first page, in bold letters, I wrote, "The truth doesn't live in courtrooms. It lives in memory, and memory never dies." Beneath that, photographs. Their childhood birthdays, family trips, Christmas mornings, each image paired with receipts. The dollhouse my daughter had begged for, the baseball camp my son insisted on. Every smile they'd ever given me, bought with hours of my labor. The message was simple: I built you. I can dismantle you. That night, my daughter called me. First time in 5 years she dialed willingly. Her voice was raw, desperate. "Dad, stop. Please. I'll do anything. Just tell me what you want." I let the silence stretch until she sobbed. Then I said, calm, flat, "I want you to remember what you said at my funeral. That I was nothing. That my life was a pile of junk worth $50. You laughed. And now the world laughs at you." She tried to protest, but her voice broke. I hung up before she could finish. Meanwhile, my son cracked in a different way. He stormed into his office the next morning only to find his desk stripped bare, his nameplate gone. His partners had voted him out. Cameras caught him leaving the building with a cardboard box, reporters shouting questions he couldn't answer. He shoved through the crowd, jaw tight, eyes hollow. And when he reached his car, another envelope waited under the wiper blade. My handwriting again. Inside, a single page. A deed transfer. The house he lived in, my house, now legally tied to liens from debts he'd never known I recorded. Because I had kept every slip, every unpaid loan he'd begged me to cover, every emergency check I'd written in silence. And now those records were public property. They met me in person 3 nights later. It wasn't planned, not for them. But I'd set the stage. A quiet diner on the edge of town, one I knew they still visited. I was already in the booth when they walked in, pale, exhausted, looking 10 years older than last week. My son froze first. My daughter's hand went to her mouth. I sipped my coffee, calm as ever, and said, "Sit." They obeyed. The weight of silence between us was heavier than any gavel. "You faked your death," my son whispered. "No," I said, leaning forward. "I tested my family, and you failed in record time." My daughter's eyes brimmed, but I saw no remorse, only fear. She reached across the table, her nails digging into the formica. "Dad, what do you want from us?" I smiled, slow, deliberate. What I always wanted. Respect. But now, I'll settle for something else. I slid a folder across the table. Thick, heavy, bulging with documents. Their names stared up at them in bold type. "Sign these," I said, my voice cold steel. "Or tomorrow's news cycle will finish what I started." They didn't even ask what was inside. They knew better. As they fumbled with pens, I sat back and watched the last of their arrogance bleed out of them. My children, who once called me worthless, now trembling under the weight of my words. But I wasn't finished, because those papers weren't the end. They were only the beginning of a reckoning they couldn't imagine. The pen scraped across paper like knives on bone. My daughter signed first, her hand shaking so badly the ink smeared. My son hesitated longer, but the look I gave him cut through his pride. He scrawled his name with a bitter grunt, then slammed the pen down as if he could wound me with plastic. "Happy?" he hissed. I leaned back, folded the pages neatly into the folder, and slid it back into my coat. "No," I said calmly, but satisfied. They didn't know what they'd just done. Not yet. The documents weren't simple. They weren't contracts or confessions. They were transfers. My son had just signed over his shares of Walker Holdings. Every asset, every property, every account he thought he controlled now belonged to me. My daughter had signed a deed in lieu papers for her suburban palace. Effective immediately, the house reverted to my trust. And because I'd built it with layers of lawyers and shell entities, they wouldn't even know the full weight until the sheriff's notice arrived. 2 days later, it began. The local paper ran the headline, "Children of Henry Brooks voluntarily relinquish assets amid scandal." Reporters swarmed their front yard. My daughter screamed at them through the door, her husband waving useless threats. My son tried to bluff his way through an interview. "This is just a misunderstanding. We're victims here." But the cameras didn't buy it. His sweat told the real story. And then came the eviction notices. Friday morning, movers arrived at my daughter's driveway with police escorts. Cameras caught her sobbing as furniture was hauled out, her designer couch tilted on its side, scraping the doorway. Neighbors watched from lawns, whispering, recording. Her perfect image cracked in broad daylight. My son's humiliation was sharper. His office, emptied by his own board. His partners released a statement. Walker Holdings will no longer be associated with individuals under federal scrutiny. They cut him off clean. By nightfall, the siblings had nothing left but each other. And even that was crumbling. I watched it unfold from a distance. Coffee in hand, TV glowing with their downfall. But the sweetest part wasn't the loss of money or homes. It was the footage, the raw sound bites. My daughter shouting, "This is our father's fault." My son snarling, "If he's alive, I'll kill him myself." And the crowd around them, jeering, shaking heads, treating them like disgraced royalty. The same children who once laughed at my junk notebooks were now defined by them. That evening, I delivered the final twist. Another package on their doorstep. This time, a single flash drive. Inside were hours of recordings from my hidden cameras, Every greedy comment, every laugh at my expense, every cruel word they'd spoken about me while selling off my life. And one line at the end, my voice steady over black screen. You thought you buried me, but you only buried yourselves. Respect is earned. Betrayal is remembered. When they plugged it in, I imagined silence filled the room. Silence thicker than any grave dirt. Because the game wasn't about money anymore. It was about legacy. And I'd already written the final chapter. I expected them to go quiet, to retreat into shame, lick their wounds, and wait for the storm to pass. But my children were mine, after all, stubborn to the bone. And instead of silence, they tried to fight back. The first strike came from my daughter. She arranged a sit-down interview with one of those glossy morning shows, the kind that airs between cooking segments and celebrity gossip. She painted herself in soft light, wore her hair pulled back, pearls at her neck, the picture of the wounded, misunderstood daughter. I loved my father, she said, voice trembling on cue. But he struggled. He kept secrets. He wasn't always, well, a smear hidden behind crocodile tears. She wanted the world to think I was senile, delusional, unfit to testify. She even suggested that the notebooks, my life's work, were forgeries planted by bitter outsiders. The host nodded gravely. The cameras panned in close. She thought she'd spun gold. But 20 minutes later, the network cut to breaking news, leaked footage from my hidden cameras. Her own voice, clear as a bell, laughing, "Those notebooks are trash. Who cares if he's dead? At least we'll get something out of it." The anchor looked stunned. "It seems, Mrs. Walker's words on air don't match her private conversations." By evening, the hashtag notebook liar trended nationwide. Her crocodile tears dried up fast. My son was bolder, nastier. He called a press conference on the courthouse steps, surrounded by a handful of loyalists still clinging to him like barnacles on a sinking ship. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the microphone, jaw tight, voice booming with false confidence. My so-called father is orchestrating this entire circus. He faked his death. He framed me. He never finished. Because as he spoke, another screen behind the reporters lit up. I'd arranged it. A local activist group had agreed to project a clip onto the courthouse wall. There he was, in my own living room months earlier, telling his sister, "Dad's life is worthless. The moment he croaks, I'm selling everything he touched." The crowd gasped. Reporters turned their cameras from him to the wall. He sputtered, choked on excuses. His loyalists melted away into the sidewalk. By the 6 o'clock news, he wasn't a crusader. He was a hypocrite caught red-handed. They retreated then, for real. Boarded up lines, no cars in the driveway, lawyers' numbers on speed dial. But desperation breeds recklessness. On Thursday night, my daughter called me again. Not begging this time, threatening. "Dad, if you don't stop this, we'll tell everyone about you. About what you did in the 70s. About the company you ruined. About the deals you cut." Her voice cracked with rage. I let her rant, then answered, calm as stone, "You think I hid my sins? No, sweetheart. I recorded them. Every single one. I left nothing unaccounted for. The world knows exactly who I am. Do they know who you are?" The silence that followed was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. Friday morning, the final blow landed. The Attorney General's office released a statement. Indictments were coming. Not against me. Against them. Fraud. Conspiracy. Asset misrepresentation. Because the forged papers I'd slipped into those notebooks weren't just believable. They were damning. Enough to open formal cases. Enough to drag my children through years of depositions and hearings. Their faces splashed across every screen, branded not as heirs, but as criminals. That evening, I drove past my old house. Police tape fluttered across the driveway. Reporters camped on the lawn, waiting for scraps. Through the curtains, I caught a glimpse of my daughter crumpled on the couch, mascara streaked down her cheeks. My son paced the kitchen, hands in his hair, barking into a dead phone. They looked smaller somehow. Not the towering, dismissive adults who had once called me useless. Just frightened children again, cornered by consequences they never believed would touch them. I parked down the block, killed the engine, and just watched. Watched until the porch light flicked off, until their shadows disappeared into darkness. Before I'll tell you what happened next, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Thank you. Later that night, I opened a fresh notebook in my motel room. First page. Clean. Waiting. I wrote slowly, deliberately. They sold my life for $50. I sold theirs for nothing at all. Respect is earned. Betrayal is punished. Tomorrow, the final cut. I closed the book, slid it onto the stack beside me, and turned off the lamp. The storm was almost over. But the reckoning? That was just one step away. The courthouse smelled of damp stone and nervous sweat. Reporters clogged the steps like carrion birds, their microphones jutting out like beaks. Police held the line with bored faces, but their eyes never left the doors, waiting for the moment my children would walk through. They didn't know I was already inside. The ethics committee chamber wasn't grand, but the weight inside it could crush a man. Dark wood benches, flags on the wall. A row of stern faces behind a raised dais, pens poised, waiting to record lies. My son sat at the defense table, suit rumpled, jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. My daughter beside him, makeup thick, hands clutching tissues she never used. Their lawyer whispered between them, but it was no use. Fear seeps deeper than legal advice. The clerk cleared her throat. Hearing in the matter of fraudulent transfers, corporate conspiracy, and willful concealment of evidence. State versus Walker and Walker. Their names. My name once. Now a weapon. The prosecutor stood first. Calm, precise, like a man already sure of victory. He placed a stack of my notebooks on the table, pages flagged, tabs sticking out like wounds. Exhibit A, he said. The Diaries of Henry Brooks. Handwritten entries detailing decades of transactions, corroborated by supporting documents. Exhibit B, supplemental materials, letters, contracts, and personal notes, some signed by the defendants themselves. Gasps rippled through the room. My son shot to his feet. That's not real. He forged those. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Sit down, Mr. Walker. His lawyer tugged him back down, hissing in his ear. My daughter buried her face in her hands. I didn't move. I simply sat in the back row, hat low, watching. Waiting. The prosecutor continued. We also have recordings, Your Honor, captured from the decedent's home security system. The defendants can be heard mocking their father, declaring intent to liquidate his estate, and admitting their knowledge of the notebooks. A scream lit up. My daughter's voice filled the chamber. Those notebooks are trash. Who cares if he's dead? At least we'll get something out of it. My son's laughter followed, sharp as a knife. The jury of the public, reporters, officials, neighbors, inhaled as one. That sound was better than any verdict. Finally, the prosecutor looked toward the gallery. Mr. Brooks, he said, would you step forward? The chamber turned. Every head, every pair of eyes fixed on me. I stood slowly, the weight of years balanced in my spine, and walked down the aisle. My cane tapped against the stone floor like a metronome. When I reached the witness stand, my son's face drained of blood. My daughter whispered, no, no, like a prayer turned curse. The clerk swore me in. My voice steady, clear. I am Henry Brooks, and I am very much alive. Chaos erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, the gavel thundered again. My children stared as if seeing a ghost. In a way, they were. The questions came fast, sharp. I answered them all. Yes, I wrote the notebooks. Yes, I embedded records of corruption. Yes, I deliberately left copies to test whether my children would protect their family or sell it. They sold it, I said flatly. $50 was the opening bid for their father's life. The silence after that line was heavy as stone. When it ended, when the hearings adjourned and the press stormed outside to broadcast the spectacle, I stayed behind. I waited until my children had no choice but to face me in the empty hallway. They approached like prisoners awaiting sentence. My son tried for anger, but his voice cracked. You ruined us. I stepped closer, close enough to smell the sweat on him. No, I said quietly. You ruined yourselves. I just wrote it down. My daughter's eyes brimmed. Why, Dad? Why couldn't you just forgive us? I looked at her, and for a moment I remembered birthdays, scraped knees, her small hand clutching mine. Then I remembered the laughter, the auction, the word trush. Forgiveness is for the innocent, I said. You buried me alive. Now you know how it feels. I turned and walked away. Their footsteps didn't follow. They couldn't. Outside, cameras flared. Reporters screamed questions I didn't hear. The cold Denver air hit my face, clean and sharp. I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the chaos below, a city that now knew my children for what they were. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply spoke one last sentence, loud enough for the microphones to catch. Respect is earned. Betrayal is remembered. Then I walked into the light. The circle was closed.